Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 24 today. Having shown you in the last video, if you haven't seen it, I really encourage you to do the introduction to the three chapters that we'll be engaging here, 1 Samuel 24, 25, and 26. And as I showed in the last video, and I won't go over it all now, but just to orient ourselves as we enter into this chapter, 24 and 26 are very parallel, as many scholars have noted, and you can see the color-coded pieces there, especially at the beginning where we see today, Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel to look for David, and we see the same thing in chapter 26. So we're going to have to look at how those are related, but today in the next few videos we're just going to look at chapter 24, and then we'll come around to chapter 26 after we do chapter 25. That makes sense, huh? So in addition to looking at these three chapters as a unit, we have to, of course, see them in their narrative context, which means chapter 24 follows chapter 23. This is a very profound video so far, isn't it? But just to look back so we can be on the same page, in the last couple of verses on the left side of the screen, you can see Saul stopped pursuing David, which he'd been doing for a couple of chapters, and went against the Philistines, and therefore that place was called Rock of Escape, and David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. And now, as we begin the chapter 24 in the next verse, and remembering, of course, that the Hebrew doesn't have chapters and verses, so first readers back in the day would have not known any break here, and there is no real break here. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. So whatever is going on with the Philistines, nothing of that is described. It doesn't describe there's a war or whether Saul was successful or anything that happened. It's just a pause in the action to allow David to escape from him, from what we saw in the previous videos in chapter 23, and set up what we're going to be seeing here in this chapter as the chase continues. And as this chase continues, what I'd like to highlight as we begin this, and I looked last time at the theme or the questions that we are faced with in terms of the structure of these chapters, how they link together. But now I'd look to look at it in terms of the theology of it, of what's really going on in the narrative here. So the question that really holds these chapters together is this. Two questions, really. How will David become king in place of Saul? And what will Yahweh's role in that process be? And as we'll see right in our initial scene, I shouldn't have to say this, but in our world, as in their world, it comes up all the time. Correlation is not causation. And so we'll see a number of times where things happen and people infer it's Yahweh's doing, or it could be Yahweh's doing. But Yahweh doesn't ever speak here. The narrator will only refer to Yahweh actually doing something one time in these three chapters, not till chapter 26. Otherwise, people are talking about Yahweh. And as many commentators have said, the claims made about Yahweh are very questionable, not just based on what my theology or your theology might be, especially if you consider yourself a Jesus follower and you're reading in light of the New Testament, but simply in terms of the theology within the books of Samuel. That these characters are not prophets as such. They're not having a direct line to Yahweh. They may at some time. David does speak to Yahweh at times, but there's nothing about anybody being in direct communication with Yahweh or receiving a vision or a message from Yahweh in these chapters. They're just making inferences. And that's really raising an interesting question for the audience, which is to say, when reading these sacred texts, how do the readers or listeners know that the writers have actually known that it was Yahweh's will and aren't just claiming that? Because the idea that many Christians come with, that all of the Bible is inspired by God, is a very late argument based on one verse in a letter that supposedly is from Paul but probably isn't, and that creates a lot of controversy nowadays. But whatever we might think about Paul and the authorship of the Timothy letters, they were certainly not written at the time that the books of Samuel were. So there was no Bible at the time, and the question of whether these texts were true or sacred or not, or whether they were simply royal propaganda claiming Yahweh on the side of one party amongst the many groups who competed, as we see in the books of Kings and in the prophets, there were many divisions within Israel or Judah, as there are in almost any culture, over which direction you should go and what is our God's view about us or them or what we're doing or what they're doing, etc. So the fact that Yahweh is repeatedly spoken of is actually something that is leading the writers to have the audience consider, how do we know when Yahweh is behind something, whether it's our monarchy or our enemies' activities, whether that's in the exile or Persia, etc. So it's really a profound question that is taking place within this chase story of two people who each believe that Yahweh has chosen them to be king. So as we enter into that, let's look at our scene with that question in mind, and it begins with David in the wilderness of En-Gedi. So we need to look at that a little bit. En-Gedi was an oasis, and you can see on just my simple Bible atlas, it's right down here in the Dead Sea. And of course, being near the Dead Sea doesn't make it an oasis, because the Dead Sea then and now was salt and couldn't be drunk. But as I'll show you in a moment from Google Maps, there's an oasis here. There is fresh water and a waterfall that, not surprisingly, is called the David Waterfall in that area. And although we can't know exactly where David was, as described in the strongholds of En-Gedi in 23:29, or in the wilderness of En-Gedi in 24:1, which certainly suggests something other than an oasis. It's certainly going to be in a cave, as we'll see. It's further described in verse 2 as in the directions of the rocks of the wild goats. But as my note below suggests, that phrase, the term is only here, and there's a reference to goats elsewhere and to rocks elsewhere, but this particular place is only mentioned here, so we don't know exactly where it is. Let's look at Google Maps for a minute. So here you can see where En-Gedi is from the big perspective, and you can see how all the desert around, but there are also rocks and caves in there. So as we zoom in a little bit, you can see now that what looks dark there are shadows from those mountains. Those are not caves themselves. They're not that big. But when we really come in here to what's an national eco park at En-Gedi, and if you look online, you can see many pictures of kids playing in these in the waterfall and the pool there. We see the pool that's right on the edge of the cave, known as the David Cave. But one of the questions we're going to have to consider is, how big is that cave? And honestly, I was not able to find any evidence online in pictures or words that says, how deep is it? It's certainly not the biggest cave in the world. That's in Vietnam. So I don't have dimensions on it, but that's going to be an interesting question as our story unfolds. So let's keep that in mind, and as we do, I just want to remind of the verbal links between this chapter and chapter 25 that I looked at last time, so we can see that this is partly about David and Saul, but partly about Nabal and David, which may as well be about David and Saul. So although on this chart the column on the left is following chapter 25 in order, so on the right side verses from 24 and 26 are not necessarily in the same order, they are at the beginning here, where we see in chapter 25 that Nabal had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and Saul had 3,000 men, and David is at the rocks of the wild goats, and then comes to the sheepfolds that we see here in verse 3, which are irrelevant to the story, just as Maon, as we'll see, is irrelevant in chapter 25, just ways that we can make these links. So we'll be paying attention to how this story and the Nabal story are about the same question, which remains, how will David be king in place of Saul, and what is Yahweh's role? As we look at the key words for this chapter here, we'll see that a curious one that most translations don't show, for whatever reason I don't know, is the repeated use of behold, the Hebrew henna, or vahenna, and behold, and we see it a number of times here, and that's used to draw attention. So it's really highlighting that the writer here, putting in the mouths of David and of Saul, as we'll see later, the question of how important this is, what a big moment this is. But when you look at the larger picture, you can also see how much Yahweh is in the story, at least being talked about, even though he's not there. We'll see the key phrase, the corner of Saul's cloak, named a number of times, of course the cave itself, and the question of killing and rising up, which is a symbolic issue as well as a literal issue, to stand up from sitting, but also to rise up against somebody, as we use the same figure of speech today. So let's keep this in mind, which also includes some of my translation changes based on scholars who've noted that New RSV and others often don't reveal all of what's there in the Hebrew, including behold, as we see here. So, entering into our passage, Saul returned here, and as my note below says, no battle or engagement is narrated nor language of war, so we don't need to worry about that. From following the Philistines, he was told. So we're continuing to hear the sense that messengers are reporting back to Saul and back to David on the whereabouts of each other. We don't know exactly how that's going to happen. If you remember from the map, we don't know exactly where Saul is. It just says he stopped pursuing David and went against the Philistines, and he returned, but it doesn't say returned to where, whether that's to his home in Gibeah. If so, again, looking at the map, that's quite a ways. You're Gibeah of Saul up here and En-Gedi down here, and that's a long walk, and that would be the only way they could get there, other than by riding on a donkey, which only kings and important people do. We've seen donkeys, but we haven't seen people riding on them. So David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi, and then Saul takes 3,000 chosen men. The word for chosen here means tested, so these are the battle-tested men. We've seen him have many more in the past, and of course we heard earlier the women in the streets singing, Saul is killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. presumably that's propagandistic and celebratory exaggeration, but in relation to that we hear Saul taking 3,000. Last we heard David had 600, and we'll hear that again later. That certainly says if it's going to come out to all-out war between the people of Saul and the people of David, Saul certainly has the advantage, but that's not what's going to happen in the event, as we'll see. So he went to look for David and his men in the direction of the rocks of the wild goats. Of course, it doesn't say that's where David is in particular, but he had to pick somewhere, because in wilderness En-Gedi is a large area, as you could see from the Google Maps, especially when you're on foot without things like binoculars, etc. So he came to the sheepfolds beside the road, and that's already an unusual thing. The fact that there would be sheepfolds near En-Gedi because of the oasis is not too surprising. That there's water, and so the sheep would be able to drink, and there'd be fodder for them to graze on. But whose sheepfolds are these? When we get to the Nabal story, of course, as I just noted, we're told that he has 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. So the sheepfold here, like Maon in the beginning of chapter 25, it seems to me, are just markers that the writers are using to say, remember, this is connected with Nabal. Because this story in chapter 24 has nothing whatsoever to do with sheep. So he came to the sheepfolds beside the road where there was a cave. It doesn't tell us anything about the cave. The word for cave, ma'arah, literally means nakedness, but it's never used that way in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Bible. We've seen caves a couple of times earlier. We can go back to 22:1 and see already David has escaped from Saul and to the cave of Adullam when his brothers and fathers heard of it. So this is the second time that David is escaping from Saul in a cave. And there are many caves in that area. Of course, there's the caves of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and the caves where the Nag Hammadi documents were found from Egypt. And so in these limestone areas, there are many caves. But some of them are just small things that one person could hide in, or you could hide a few jars of text in. Whether you could put a lot of people in is another question. But here we begin to get to the scatological humor that's involved in this story, and we'll see it more than once. Not only scatological, but sexual humor, as we'll see. So the word cave again means nakedness, and Saul went in. The New RSV has to relieve himself, but literally it means to cover his feet. And even something as traditional as the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon notes, a euphemism for evacuating the bowels, although it's only here in the Masoretic text. But we see it in a similar way, for example, in Judges 3:24. This is the hilarious story of the judge Ehud dispatching the fat king Eglon by sinking a knife so deep, or a spear, so deep in his belly, the belly sucks it up, and he leaves him in the cool chamber, which is to say the outhouse, while his servants await outside. So that's a scene we see here when he's described relieving himself in the cool chamber. So that's the same figure of speech that we see in our story, in our passage. But the narrator has tricked us a little bit in the sense of the sequence. Notice how we see the sequence. We're just following Saul, taking his men and going to the sheepfolds. And we'd heard that David was there in the wilderness of En-Gedi. But what we find is that when Saul goes in to relieve himself, notice he must leave his men outside, which makes sense. Why would they come with him to relieve his bowels? David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. What a surprise to us as readers that they would be in there. Why are they in there? Presumably staying cool. It'd certainly be cooler in the cave in the heat of the day, certainly for protection. But let's look at a couple of my notes to see some details here. So this is the first reference in this passage of David and his men, but the last time we heard there were 400 from chapter 22, where we just looked at in the cave of Adullam. But we'll see in chapter 25, 600. Are we to imagine they're all in that cave? And that's what I couldn't get data to figure out to prepare this video. Is it actually possible that you could get 400 men in the cave of En-Gedi? I don't know. But for Saul to be isolated there, just squatting, while David and his men are behind him, is quite the moment. And as you could see from the Google Maps, there are many caves, and so the idea that they would happen to wander into this particular cave is what leads the men of David to the response in the next verse. So as we look more at the details, they were sitting here. That's the word for sitting or for settling. And as my note below says, after all the running and pursuing, the scene has both men in stillness. Saul squatting to relieve himself, and David and all his men in the cave, described as the innermost part of the cave here, using a word that means in the recesses which can have the double meaning of merah, nakedness. So it can be a sexual kind of term, although it's not used that way here, as thighs, or as we see here, yarcha, for innermost or extreme recesses. It's only here in 1 Samuel, but it's often used in a neutral form for the far distance of stars or lands. So it's certainly to say in the depth of the cave, but there's certainly at least an implicit sexual euphemism for that, since things like caves and wells are often female vaginal symbols, as one might expect. So there's some interesting subtext of sexuality going on here between David and Saul. And we'll see that played out a different way in chapter 26 around Saul's spear in the ground. So we'll see that next time in the parallel. So with the finding of Saul just walking right to them, the men of David reached this conclusion. Here is the day of which Yahweh said to you, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. And that really is a key moment, and we'll see it repeated over and over again in chapter 24 and 26. Should David run on that example here? As my note below says, the terms are now reversed. David has the advantage over Saul. And as my note further down below has, the careful listeners come to expect quite a range of possibility in the narrative, but nothing equals the tension here between possible regicide and a royal vulnerability tinged with the scatological. Do we as readers believe this? What do we think? The text does not resolve it. David will reach a conclusion, as we'll see next video, but the text will not resolve the question of whether Yahweh has arranged this, what seems like a remarkable coincidence, that despite all the territory around, that Saul would walk in and become vulnerable in the cave where David and all his men were. So let's look at a little more of the detail of what they say. The word here, hinna, can be translated here or behold. So we could hear, behold, the day of which Yahweh said to you, or here, either way. But the question of Yahweh said to you, we don't know. As Bodner notes below, there's no such quote. David's men are full of the same foul refuse that Saul is presently evacuating. These are men who want Saul liquidated. And as my note down below, from Barbara Green notes, of some 25 assertions made about God in the 91 verses of chapters 24 to 26, most are rendered dubious in some way. Most of the suggestions made about God come down to God's role in either sanctioning or restraining David from violence against his opponent. And of course, it's not just generically violence against his opponent, it's violence against Yahweh's anointed, which is a key word that we can see here, this question of Yahweh's anointed. And we'll see it repeatedly in the story, here and there. So continuing here, said to you, again omitting a henna here, which we see there, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. So even if it's Yahweh's will that Saul showed up there, it's still leaving it up to David to do what's good, which is, and this is always the phrase, what looks good in your eyes, which is almost from the Deuteronomic perspective a negative thing. That's what we see at the end of Judges with the absence of a king. Everybody does what seems right in their own eyes, which also in a book like Genesis we saw when Lot looked out and looked at the land that looked good in his own eyes rather than listening to where Yahweh would send him, and he ends up becoming a prisoner of war and risking his uncle's life to save him. So the message of it looks good in your own eyes is not a positive one from the perspective of the authors of the larger Deuteronomistic history or of Genesis either. What one should do is listen to Yahweh and do Yahweh's will. But sometimes Yahweh's will is inferred from other things, not from a direct encounter. So the men of David are not making an unreasonable claim that this coincidence could have been arranged by Yahweh. So David responds without words, but does something. It says he went, literally he stood, going into action, and stealthily, although this word Balaam was only used once elsewhere, it can be translated very differently. If we do it in Judges 4:21, we see here that it's described as softly, and it can also simply mean privately. So it doesn't have to mean stealthily, although it would have to be stealthily to be able to go up to this person who, after all, is not sleeping, is just squatting, and be able to do this. And again, let's look at the last details of this before we end for today. The word for cut off carrot here, which is also the word for cutting a covenant, and that's implied here, but as Brueggemann notes below, a playful euphemism for cutting off the penis and so rendering Saul helpless, void of manhood, and bereft of a future. And David certainly knows the symbolism of that here, around this phrase, the corner of Saul's cloak. Two words that are important here. Kanaf for wing and me'el for robe here, and are key words. And elsewhere, The wings can be used for wings of the wind or wings of birds, but there are also examples of this, as you can see from Deuteronomy below and for Ruth, where there's a sexual connotation of that. Brueggemann is not off in saying that this is a symbolism of castrating the king here and cutting off his future, which will become an element we'll see in the conversations between David and Saul, both in chapter 24 and chapter 26. And so we'll stop there, but you can see already in the next verse, David already has a change of heart, and the sequence in verses 5, 6, and 7 are one for that. Bye-bye. That lead people like Edinburgh, whose chart I noted last time, to question whether this is the original version of the chapter or whether this has been adapted from chapter 26. But we'll get to that next time. See you then.